Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
This isn't just a deep dive into, some abstract theory. We are looking at an examination of a terrifying collapse of everything.
Right.
We are plunging straight into a text that details civilization hitting the absolute reset button.
And not in the way we usually imagine it. Not slowly, not with time to prepare.
No, not gradually, not over millennia, but in a matter of weeks.
Yeah.
The topic today is a sudden, catastrophic global ice age.
It is, I think, the ultimate systemic failure scenario laid bare.
Yeah.
When we approach this material, what we're really looking at is the precise moment where scientific consensus, the belief that a rapid climate shift on this scale was impossible,
Right.
which is violently overturned by reality. The text documents a planetary trauma, and the central antagonist in the whole story is the speed.
That speed, that velocity is what makes the analysis so brutal.
Right.
We are examining a phenomenon where global temperatures plummeted by an unprecedented 40 degrees Celsius.
In just 2 months.
In just 2 months. It's almost unbelievable. This was not a gradual cooling that allowed for any kind of strategic retreat or, adaptation.
No.
The sources call it the apocalypse bronco, the white apocalypse. It was an immediate, violent deep freeze, and it was swift enough to trap billions of people in the very mechanisms that were meant to sustain them.
And this deep dive for you is really a shortcut to understanding that dependency. The text we're looking at, it serves as a kind of catastrophic instruction manual on what happens when every single layer of modern infrastructure, from power generation and logistics to the invisible networks of finance and governance, it all fails simultaneously and with no hope of rebooting.
Because what the sources detail is more than just environmental destruction, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about what happens when necessity just instantly erases morality. When the physical fight for survival becomes so absolute that the entire foundation of human ethics, it just dissolves into the frost. We're going to look at how complexity, our civilization's greatest achievement, became our fatal weakness. And we should probably start where the density was highest.
We begin, logically, in the American metropolises. These cities, they were built on the premise of perpetual energy flow, right? Sophisticated logistics.
Constant input.
Constant input. They became destruction zones almost instantly. The source material shows how density and this hyper-reliance caused destruction here to be arguably more rapid and comprehensive than almost anywhere else.
Okay, so let's start with the big one. New York City. You have a dense population of 8.3 million people, instantly overwhelmed.
Completely.
The text describes Manhattan transforming into this island of icy, monumental despair. We think of skyscrapers as being safe, strong structures. But the Empire State, One World Trade Center, they just quickly became frozen monuments. Sealed against the cold, sure, but offering absolutely no sustainable refuge.
And the initial phase, it was defined by this desperate, almost futile search for heat. When the grid failed, and it failed fast, there was no centralized power.
Of course not.
So the sources tell us people, driven by pure instinct, they began burning anything combustible. And you have to think about the volume of what that means. They burned furniture, structural elements from their own apartments, and tragically, massive public libraries.
The sources specifically highlight the psychological trauma of burning the libraries. It's such a potent symbol.
It's everything.
Centuries of accumulated human knowledge, irreplaceable records, literature, complex science, all of it reduced to just mere hours of flickering, insufficient warmth.
The logic was immediate, though. It was brutal. The need for heat, right now, in this second, it trumped the value of civilization itself. There was no debate.
And yet this effort was. It was utterly insufficient. A concrete and steel structure, a thing designed to endure for centuries, it retains cold aggressively.
It's a heat sink.
It's a massive heat sink. So a few hours of fire from burning wood or even, priceless books, it's negligible against a 40-degree temperature drop. People were simply delaying the inevitable freeze while destroying their collective heritage for nothing.
But the true terror, the one that trapped and claimed the most lives right at the beginning, was subterranean. It was under their feet.
The subway system.
The subway. That vital artery, serving 5.5 million daily passengers, it didn't just halt, it became actively lethal.
How so?
The text details how water seepage from the surface, combined with the thermal contraction of the tracks and the tunnels themselves, led to rapid flooding and then, of course, subsequent freezing.
So the water gets in and then just turns to solid ice.
And it expands. This created immense internal pressure, causing sections of the tunnel ceilings to collapse. Thousands were trapped in what the sources call frozen darkness.
That's a terrifying phrase.
It is.
Yeah.
Sealed off, isolated. Their deaths were agonizingly slow in these frigid, collapsing tunnels beneath the city they helped sustain. It's a profound illustration of how our urban solutions, our greatest infrastructural achievements, they become the most inescapable death traps.
And if you manage to stay above ground, the supposedly open spaces, they only offer this brief illusion of safety.
Central Park.
Central Park, yeah. Initially, it was used as an encampment. People were burning park benches, old decorative trees were chopped down for fuel. But it devolved, and it devolved quickly.
Yeah.
The source notes that within just 3 weeks, the park was a landscape of deep snow and accumulated corpses.
And crucially, the smoke from those desperate small campfires,
Hmm?
it didn't create a community, it acted as a beacon.
A target.
A huge target. It attracted organized armed gangs who quickly recognized that anyone weak enough to rely on an open fire was likely carrying the last remaining scraps of supplies. So the park transitioned from this idea of a refuge to a contested battleground with violence governing access to every single resource.
Let's move across the country, because here we face this catastrophic irony of Los Angeles, a metropolis of 3.8 million people built entirely on the premise of eternal sunshine.
Yeah, the ultimate contrast.
The city was instantly paralyzed, not by a delicate snow, but by an overwhelming, relentless ice storm that brought temperatures down to levels their infrastructure could never, ever manage.
The sources really focus on the gridlock. I mean, think about those massive highway systems, the 405, the 10, the 101, they're always congested, right?
Highway.
They became instant frozen parking lots. With literally millions of abandoned cars, people died at the wheel or they froze just trying to walk away because they were completely unprepared for that kind of extreme cold.
The failure was just so systemic. Unlike in eastern cities where people might have a winter coat somewhere in a closet,
Right.
Angelinos were clad for mild weather. They perished within meters of their vehicles because their clothes couldn't protect them from that sudden, deep, biting cold. And the symbolism of Hollywood is just visceral. The global center of fantasy, of illusion, it just burns.
And those iconic studios, the Beverly Hills mansions, they were deliberately torched. And this wasn't, random vandalism. It was a desperate, organized attempt by crowds to gain some temporary heat.
It illustrates that instant, violent reversal of priorities. The entire economy of illusion and glamour was instantly rendered worthless, and it was just incinerated for basic thermal survival.
And the logistical nightmare, it centered on the Pacific coast. The massive port of Los Angeles, the gateway for global commerce, it froze completely solid.
Which created this agonizing scenario.
Yeah.
You have millions of tons of accessible food and supplies locked in these massive cargo ships.
Right there.
Sometimes just meters away from the shore, but entirely inaccessible.
The source material details these fatal, almost routine attempts. People, starving and desperate, tried to walk across the newly formed ice sheets to reach the moored ships.
It's just a terrible idea.
A terrible idea.
Yeah.
The ice was unstable, you had thermal stresses, hidden currents creating unexpected cracks, and many just fell through. They either drowned or died instantly from the shock of the freezing water. The text really drives home the agony of that. You're dying of starvation and exposure, but you're surrounded by an unreachable abundance.
Okay, now we turn to Chicago, a city supposedly built to handle the cold, home to 2.7 million. And Chicago is, hardened to winter. But not for this escalation. The cold they faced transcended mere weather. The sources describe the Arctic winds as just killers.
The static temperature, the number on the thermometer plummeted to minus 50 degrees Celsius. But the wind chill, which is the crucial factor in the physics of hypothermia,
What your body actually feels.
what your body feels, it reached a staggering minus 70 degrees Celsius. The source explicitly quantifies this horror. 5 minutes of skin exposure was sufficient to induce lethal hypothermia.
Live minutes.
5 minutes. That level of cold defeats almost all forms of standard shelter. It turns houses into rapid refrigerators.
And the infrastructure just crumbled under the physical reality of that freeze. Lake Michigan froze solid. But, more dangerously, the expanding mass of ice exerted this immense pressure, crushing coastal structures.
The iconic Navy Pier, many of the lakeside buildings, they suffered structural collapse as the ice sheet just physically pushed inward.
But the tragedy of the Willis Tower, the fourth tallest building in the U.S., it's a real engineering lesson in dependency.
At 442 meters, it became an impassable vertical tomb. The sources detail the mechanisms here. The elevators froze, obviously, but more critically, the complex internal water riser pipes, They burst due to the expansion of the ice,
Oh, wow.
turning the emergency stairwells into vertical ice chutes.
So there's no way down.
No way down. People trapped in the upper stories were completely sealed off. They couldn't descend. And the building's massive central core, which was built for protection, it became a giant refrigerated chimney.
And meanwhile, down at street level, the moral breakdown was absolute.
This is where the source delivers one of its most chilling observations regarding human instinct under duress. The documentation describes this desperate shift, mothers suffocating crying babies.
Just to be quiet.
To ensure the sound did not attract the attention of armed looters, that single act demonstrates the absolute primal shift in priorities, the survival of the group, or even just the self. It instantly overshadowed the most sacred bond of parenthood. The noise of life became a fatal liability.
At one example, it speaks volumes about the immediate and overwhelming threat of the other. And this failure wasn't just confined to the typically cold or dense north. You look at Houston, the energy giant of the South, home to 2.3 million people.
Houston, the heart of the American oil industry, was buried under heavy ice in weeks. The entire economic structure, which is built on petrochemical processing, it just collapsed.
The refineries, which are designed for perpetual high temperatures, they must have failed spectacularly.
They did. The critical components, pumps, valves, pipelines, they froze because the antifreeze materials failed. The sheer, unexpected severity of the temperature drop just caused the brittle metals to shatter.
And the Texas Medical Center,
Yeah.
the largest medical complex in the world, it was instantly overwhelmed by hypothermia and frostbite cases.
And when the reliable electricity vanished, all that sophisticated medical equipment, MRI machines, advanced monitoring systems, life support ventilators, it all just became inert metal. Completely useless. These systems required sustained, high-quality grid power that, even if the backup generators worked, they couldn't replicate or sustain that for long.
The sources detail this agonizing regression. Surgeries being performed by candlelight, lacking any kind of reliable sterilization, relying on the most basic tools.
Amputations, which were necessary to stop the spread of frostbite, were conducted without anesthesia. The text says that the screams echoed hopelessly through the vast, now useless corridors of the world's most advanced medical facility.
And escape was virtually impossible. The infrastructure, designed for perpetual Texas heat, it failed immediately when it was frozen. The concrete roads cracked, bridges collapsed under the weight of the dense ice, trapping millions in a city designed to repel cold, but now was slowly killing its inhabitants with it.
And perhaps the cruelest natural irony of all belongs to Phoenix, Arizona.
Right.
A city of 1.6 million, engineered to conquer 50 degrees Celsius desert heat, suddenly confronted minus 30 degrees Celsius. The massive HVAC systems that defined their entire lives instantly became irrelevant.
And the heating infrastructure, which was designed for, brief, mild desert winters,
Yeah.
it would have failed instantly under that sustained severe cold.
It did. And the houses themselves, which were built to rapidly dissipate heat, they instantly became cold traps, which actually accelerated the rate of internal cooling.
And the water crisis must have been devastating. Not drought, but a freeze.
Exactly. Pipes burst everywhere, draining the reserves, and the reservoirs became impenetrable blocks of ice.
So people were forced to melt the snow, which was everywhere, for drinking water. But that task requires precious fuel and time.
And this desperate measure led to mass disease, which was exacerbated by the cold. The sources specifically highlight that widespread diarrhea in freezing temperatures was a rapid death sentence.
Why?
Because of catastrophic dehydration and electrolyte loss. It leads very quickly to shock and then hypothermia.
The final desperate flight from Phoenix centered on Sky Harbor Airport. The text describes the last, overloaded flights taking off, with people exchanging their entire lives' homes, savings for just one seat south.
But the conditions were just too extreme. Many of those planes crashed because of severe atmospheric icing, fuel gelling, and engine failure caused by the unprecedented cold at cruising altitude.
So the people left on the ground witnessing those distant falling lights, they suffered the ultimate psychological defeat.
They were described in the source as envejosos dos muertos, envious of the dead.
Envious of the dead.
Because at least their immediate agony was over. That phrase encapsulates the total psychological surrender that defined the first few weeks of the Ice Age in America.
So here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Because while America's collapse was driven by this infrastructural dependency, Europe, with its vast layers of irreplaceable history, it faced a moral crisis where history itself became currency.
And fuel.
And fuel.
A critical distinction. Europe's resource pool included not just industrial materials, but millennia of culture, architecture, and documentation. The collapse there was often defined by the systematic destruction of collective memory in exchange for temporary physical survival.
Let's look at London first. A city of almost 10 million people, 1,000 years of political history, and it falls in weeks. The Thames froze solid, which is a powerful historical marker.
The sources remind us the Thames froze in 1814, but that was this picturesque frost fair.
Right, a celebration.
This time it was the freezing of death. The temperature extremes caused unprecedented damage to historic structures. The massive thermal expansion and contraction of the ice sheet on the river put immense stress on foundations,
Causing iconic bridges like Tower Bridge and London Bridge to crack and suffer critical collapses, which would have isolated vast segments of the metropolis.
And while the elite, according to the sources, fled to secret government bunkers, the common citizens looked for heat, and the ultimate cultural crime took place at the British Museum.
This repository of human history was systematically looted and burned for fuel.
The sources detail the terrifying calculus of survival. The collection wasn't burned randomly. They went for dense combustible material. The Rosetta Stone, the key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs, was reportedly used in the pyres.
It's hard to even comprehend that.
Priceless manuscripts, even Egyptian mummies, which are rich in ancient resins and dense materials, were consumed for temporary warmth.
And you have to think about the implication. Centuries of linguistic, historical, and scientific knowledge sacrificed for just mere hours of heat.
Okay.
This wasn't destruction for destruction's sake. It was this immediate primal judgment that transient warmth was infinitely more valuable than all of recorded human history.
And at the same time, the centralized national health system collapsed totally.
Of course.
Hospitals, reliant on sustained grid power for everything from air pressure regulation to advanced life support, were abandoned when the generators failed or they just ran out of fuel.
So anyone dependent on technological mediation, diabetics needing synthesized insulin, dialysis patients, people on complex ventilation, they were instantly condemned the moment the machines switched off.
Moving across the channel, Paris, the City of Light, faced an aesthetically horrific tragedy. A city of 11 million people plunged into total darkness. The psychological shock must have mirrored the physical cold.
The Eiffel Tower, the global symbol of progress and illumination, it became a beacon of despair. The sources describe people climbing the structure, desperate to escape the violence and crowds below, only to freeze solid hundreds of feet up.
Their bodies silhouetted against the gray, frozen sky.
And the invasion of the Louvre is a study in the collapse of value. It was invaded by families who were just seeking shelter.
The text recounts the tragic detail of the Mona Lisa being ripped from the wall, its protective glass shattered, not because of any ideological vandalism, but because people needed the wall space to sleep.
Masterpieces were used as crude thermal insulation just to cover freezing bodies.
The Louvre's entire inventory, representing the pinnacle of European artistry, it just became mere physical material. A canvas or a frame was simply less effective than the ancient carved wood of the museum furniture, which was rapidly consumed for heat. The sheer volume of cultural destruction in Paris was, well, it was unprecedented.
And the ultimate symbolic rejection of wealth happened at Versailles. The former seat of absolute French royalty, Versailles, was completely ransacked and torched.
Golden mirrors were ripped out, intricate, carved wooden paneling was just consumed by fire. The sources emphasized this wasn't lootable wealth, it was combustible material needed instantly.
And this section of the source material delivers a detail about the moral collapse that it seems few cities avoided. It explicitly notes that in the chaos of Paris, cannibalism quickly transitioned from unthinkable to necessary.
The return to survival instinct was so absolute that the most deeply ingrained societal taboo simply evaporated under the pressure of starvation.
Shifting east, Berlin, a city of 3.5 million, faced a siege of ice more devastating than any war it had ever seen.
The normally efficient centralized urban heating system failed entirely when the thermoelectric plants froze solid, which turned apartment blocks into immediate refrigerators.
The cold was merciless, but the social response was immediate and brutal. The Brandenburg Gate, a witness to the rise and fall of empires, saw new horrors. Mass, public hangings of looters.
Summary justice was instantly established by organized militias over, scraps of food. This demonstrates the swiftness with which the rule of law was just replaced by the rule of force.
And just like in London, history was sacrificed for heat. The Reichstag, the German parliament building, it burned again.
But the second time, the fire wasn't a political act. It was a desperate, final sacrifice for warmth. The text makes it clear. Democracy or any political ideology doesn't warm the body. Survival instantly rejected the complex systems of governance.
And now we have to consider Moscow, Europe's largest city, 12.7 million people. Moscow had this false sense of security.
Right, they're prepared for cold.
They're prepared for minus 30 degrees Celsius. But the drop to minus 60, minus 70, the sources label it genocide. Even the famously cold-resistant Russian infrastructure and population died in massive numbers.
The structural failure here involved the limits of material science. The steel and concrete engineered for typical Russian winters became brittle and fractured under the unprecedented deep freeze, which led to widespread building collapse.
And the ultimate act of self-preservation occurred at the Kremlin.
The political and military elite sealed the gates. They survived on secret, massive underground stocks, while the general populace was just left to freeze outside.
The sources note the futility of resistance. Revolution was impossible. You can't organize a fight when your hands are frozen solid and your energy is consumed entirely by just trying to stay alive.
Anger itself froze with everything else.
But the truly immense tragedy unfolded in the Moscow metro. Being the deepest in the world, it offered some temporary refuge and it drew millions seeking that relative warmth.
However, the density, without any functional ventilation, sanitation, or running water, it turned the subway into a biohazard zone.
Diseases spread rapidly: typhus, cholera, dysentery. And here's that horrifying detail the sources provide. Millions died not just from cold or starvation, but from the unsanitary conditions, specifically from accumulated frozen feces, which led to epidemics that overwhelmed the deep tunnels. The sanitation systems, which are reliant on pumps and non-freezing water flow, had failed completely, turning the deep tunnels into massive frozen cesspools.
Finally, we travel south to the eternal city, Rome, a city of 4.3 million that survived the fall of its own empire, barbarian invasions, and plague.
Did not survive this sudden freeze.
No.
The Colosseum, 2,000 years old, became the venue for what the source calls modern gladiators, desperate citizens fighting violently over meager supplies, cans of food, or blankets.
And the Vatican, that symbol of enduring faith, it sealed itself off. But as the text dryly observes, prayer provided no thermal protection.
The desperation reached its zenith at St. Peter's Basilica. Furious crowds invaded, driven purely by the need for combustible material.
Ancient wooden benches were broken up and burned. Irreplaceable tapestries were used for insulation. The sources recount that Michelangelo's works were covered in layers of soot from the desperate fires burning within the sacred structure.
So the city burned again. Not due to the political ambitions of an emperor like Nero, but consumed by millions of desperate citizens using their own infrastructure for temporary heat.
Historical buildings became funeral pyres, darkening the already grim sky with the smoke of a collapsing civilization.
And the cascading collapse across southern Europe was instantaneous and identical in its moral outcome. Madrid saw the Palacio Real invaded and sacked in hours.
In Barcelona, the Sagrada Familia construction stopped forever because the workers froze to death.
Vienna, the city of Mozart and high culture, saw its final symphony replaced by the screams of the dying. The sources note that cultural differences just vanished instantly. They were all reduced to the same desperate state.
So if we connect all of this to the bigger picture, the comprehensive failure of infrastructure was really just the mechanism of death. It was the trigger.
Wow.
The truly profound long-term tragedy was the psychological and moral collapse that followed. The Ice Age didn't just freeze the planet. It instantly froze the concept of humanity out of the people.
And the source material meticulously breaks down this psychological devolution. It starts with the first reflexive response, the fear of flight, or what they term the panico initial, the initial panic.
The hysteria was immediate. Airports were instantly overrun. The sources describe people liquidating their entire lives, selling houses, emptying their bank accounts for a single plane seat to the equator.
This immediate rational fear of the cold quickly exposed the limits of global transportation. There weren't enough planes, not enough functional airports, and crucially, not enough jet fuel in the sub-zero temperatures.
And those who tried to drive south, hoping to outrun the cold, they suffered the most visible, protracted deaths.
Highways turned into apocalyptic parking lots. Gridlocks extending for hundreds of kilometers. Vehicles ran out of gas, engines failed, and people died trapped in the jam, their car becoming a steel coffin.
The human cost of this failure of mobility is detailed agonizingly in the text. Parents watched babies freeze in car seats, unable to generate sufficient heat. Adults trying to carry small children realized their own bodies simply couldn't function or maintain core temperature at -40°C.
The roads just became quiet, snowy cemeteries, with families found embraced in the final posture of failure.
But once that flight response failed, the fear shifted entirely to resource scarcity, and this brings us to the second and arguably most devastating fear, the fear of hunger.
Which quickly led to normalized cannibalism.
Yes. The timeline here is critical for the psychological analysis. Within 3 weeks, global supply chains, which are reliant on complex transportation and refrigeration, collapsed totally.
3 weeks.
3. Plantations were under ice, no food was arriving, stored food was rapidly consumed or locked away. The Malthusian nightmare became reality in under a month.
And the depth of the starvation overcame all other instincts surprisingly fast. The hierarchy of consumption, as detailed in the source, it began with animals.
Pets were consumed first. Then scavenging moved to rats and insects. But the ultimate taboo shattered when people realized the most abundant source of protein was the human body.
The sources outline a cold, horrific progression. First, the dead were consumed, driven by the logic of, why waste meat?
A purely practical consideration. Then the focus shifted to the dying eliminating competition while acquiring sustenance. Finally, violence became proactive. The weak, the elderly, or children separated from their groups were targeted. The text notes children disappeared at an alarming rate.
And the absolute institutionalization of this barbarism is captured in the detail of human butcher shops, literally asug humanos operating in the basements of abandoned buildings.
This suggests the swift creation of organizational structures devoted to systematic violence and processing.
What does that institutionalization tell us about the human mind?
It suggests that the immense psychological burden of consuming human flesh was overcome by necessity, and further, that the collective act of it reduced the individual moral guilt.
The civilization didn't just collapse. The sources argue its moral compass was shattered, replaced by an animalistic imperative for protein. The horrors committed, parents eating dead children, children killing weak parents for survival, fundamentally redefined what it meant to be human.
And that desperation, that immediate need to defend one's own existence, it leads directly to the third fear, the fear of the other, which bred violent tribalism.
Trust evaporated instantly. Every stranger was not just a competitor, but a potential cannibal, a thief, or a murderer.
Cities instantly fragmented into these violent insular feuds. Neighborhoods quickly barricaded themselves using debris and frozen vehicles, enforcing their borders with lethal force. If you approached a barricade without clear identification or a resource offering, you were shot on sight.
The scarcity was so profound that resources simply could not be shared.
And this fear quickly mutated into a primitive xenophobia, completely untethered from modern political ideology. Immigrants and minority groups were irrationally blamed for consuming resources, which led to mass lynchings.
The sources emphasize this was driven purely by the primal logic of resource conservation. If the tribe cannot feed everyone, anyone who is different must be eliminated.
And this xenophobia extended to the most intimate levels. Decades-long friendships ended in murder over a blanket or a can of fuel.
Romantic love became irrelevant because, as the text states starkly, couples represented two mouths, consuming resources that could sustain one person for twice as long. Every single relationship became a volatile, zero-sum game of consumption.
And finally, there was the fear of darkness. The noit eterna, the eternal night.
Without electricity, the world plunged into total sensory darkness for most of the 18 hours of a winter night. This darkness was only broken by weak, dangerous fires.
The physical terror was immediate, but the psychological terror was profound. Those small fires were beacons, attracting hungry mobs and violent looters, forcing many survivors to choose freezing darkness over dangerous light.
The lack of sensory input allowed the imagination to fill the void. Simple wind sounds became the screams of monsters.
Children, particularly, struggled with the unrelenting darkness and cold. Their constant crying added to the psychological stress of exhausted parents who, in some cases, made the agonizing choice to permanently silence those cries.
And this sense of isolation was amplified by the complete loss of global communication. Every small, freezing community believed they were utterly alone, facing the apocalypse with no hope of rescue.
This profound, pervasive sense of isolation and hopelessness led to mass suicide becoming common. Entire families, convinced they were beyond rescue and incapable of enduring prolonged agony, chose a quick death by carbon monoxide poisoning in garages or just by freezing together. The psychological collapse, the loss of hope, often preceded the physical death for millions.
So what does this all mean? The system wasn't just broken by the cold, it was permanently reversed. The Ice Age provided the mechanism for the Malthusian nightmare to erase every institution we had built over millennia.
And the most sophisticated structures of society governments were the first to fall. Political leaders either fled to deep, secret bunkers, or they died instantly. Without communication and functional infrastructure to project power, they lost all legitimacy.
Laws could not be applied. Orders could not be transmitted. The source of authority simply vanished.
And law enforcement, that critical middle layer, broke down completely. Police and military abandoned their posts, not necessarily out of malice, but to protect their own families, recognizing that a badge or uniform offered no thermal protection.
Arsenals were rapidly looted, and armed citizens quickly formed violent tribal militias based on physical proximity and dominance, not on public order.
This societal inversion was completed by the fate of the prison system. Guards fled. Prisoners either froze in their cells or were freed into the chaos.
And the text makes a stark observation. Experienced criminals, already fluent in the language of violence and resource acquisition, instantly thrived in this new world, while civil society crumbled under the weight of its own morality.
And the very foundation of our modern world, money and commerce, disappeared entirely in hours.
Paper money and massive digital fortunes, including all forms of cryptocurrencies, they became instantly worthless. The power grid that authenticated and stored that wealth was gone forever.
The new currency reverted to the most fundamental resources: food, water, fuel, and weapons. The social hierarchy flipped totally.
The billionaire with digital wealth was worth less than the mechanic who could fix a generator or the plumber who understood pipe systems.
Exactly. CEOs died while those with practical blue-collar skills became the new elite because academic or financial wealth offered no survival value whatsoever.
And commerce reverted to primitive barter, but not in a friendly, civilized exchange. It was violent trade.
Trades happened at gunpoint, enforced by immediate threat. Markets became battlegrounds. The ultimate final currency was pure violence. Who could take, took, and those who resisted were eliminated.
And perhaps the most catastrophic long-term failure was the collapse of knowledge. This wasn't merely the burning of the British Museum. It was the total loss of institutional memory across the globe.
Libraries burned universally for heat. Universities were abandoned and looted. Generations of cumulative knowledge, complex medicine, advanced engineering, theoretical physics were lost because the mechanisms for preserving or transmitting that knowledge.
Books, hard drives, networks.
They were destroyed, and the practitioners themselves died just like everyone else.
The knowledge that survived was practical and barbaric. The survivors were not the academics or the intellectuals. They were the most ruthless, the most adaptable, the least moral.
The knowledge that children acquired was not history or mathematics.
The text notes that children in the new Ice Age were learning how to hunt humans, how to identify edible meat from carrion, and the precise signs of hypothermia. The education of this new frozen era was an education for perpetual barbarism, utterly divorced from the principles that built the civilization that died.
So after 6 months, the synthesis of the situation is horrifyingly clear. The survivors were psychological fragments. Their minds were irrevocably scarred by the trauma, and their souls were killed by the necessary, heinous acts they committed to simply stay alive.
They were technically alive, yes, but functionally and collectively dead. The complex ethical civilization that took 10,000 years to build had died in a matter of months.
And while small pockets of isolated survival might exist, the sources insist that the fundamental collective identity of ethical humanity was extinct.
What remained, as the sources articulate, were rational animals fighting for survival in a hostile world. The Ice Age didn't just freeze the environment, it froze the ethics of the human species, reducing us to primitive, highly efficient predators focused solely on immediate survival.
And as the polar wind continued to howl through the dead cities, covering the countless corpses in snow, the source material leaves us with one final, profound, and deeply unsettling question.
If the heat were to eventually return and the survivors emerged from the ice having institutionalized cannibalism, systematic violence, and complete moral betrayal, would the horrors they committed make them fundamentally incapable of rebuilding civilization again?
Was the very idea of humans as special, ethical creatures proven false by the unforgiving conditions of the sudden Ice Age?
The answer, according to the deep dive into this text, lies buried beneath the ice, along with millions of frozen dreams, destroyed hopes, and the very concept of human exceptionalism.
This raises an important question. for you to consider. When faced with absolute systemic collapse, is the destruction of our institutions less devastating than the permanent destruction of our essential collective humanity?